Good evening, everybody. Oops.
There we go. Takes a few minutes for people to load, right?
Yes. Good evening, everybody. I'm Rachel. I'm the event manager for Northshire Bookstore in Saratoga Springs, New York, and Manchester Center, Vermont. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight and for your support of independent bookselling. We at Northshire are so happy to have teamed up with some amazing fellow indie bookstores for this event. Thank you to our event partners at Bookhampton, Print, a bookstore, RJ Julia Booksellers, and Wellesley Books. And thank you to all of you for your support of those fantastic community businesses. We will have time for audience questions at the end of the evening. Throughout the event, please use the Q&A box, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen, to enter in any questions that you have. I will pose as many of them as I can for you at the end of the night. I am so very excited to get to be the one to welcome Amor Towles and Richard Russo to our screens today to celebrate Towles' new novel, The Lincoln Highway. These two men have become unofficial required reading among Northshire booksellers, authors whose new books, whenever they come, are eagerly anticipated by every single person on our staff. Amor Towles is the author of the previous novels, Rules of Civility and A Gentleman in Moscow, and our book buyer, Stan Hines, called his newest novel, The Lincoln Highway, a story of epic proportions. He'll be interviewed tonight by award-winning novelist, friend of Northshire Bookstore, short story writer and memoirist, Richard Russo, whose most recent book is Chances Are. Please join me in welcoming them both to our screens tonight.
Hello, everybody.
Hey, Amor, how you doing, man?
Hey, Rick. Hey, Rick, and I know Rick feels the same way about this. He and I think I've spoken at 4 of the 5 independent bookstores that are sponsoring tonight. So we really want to appreciate, I really want to thank their participation. It's bittersweet though, having been in those stores and spoken to their local readers in person. I think, and I'm just going to say, Rick has probably been in those stores too, and we miss that. But on the other hand, it's nice to have a format that some people can join in who would not be able to attend an event in one of those stores. So anyway, thanks for all coming to tonight, joining us.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the day is coming. I think it's not far off when we're going to get back to something a little closer to what we remember and love. Let me begin by first of all saying congratulations, Amor. This book, number one, it's just a wonderful, wonderful novel, and it shot right to the top of the bestseller list. So that's got to make you pretty pleased.
Thank you, and yeah, I'm happy with its landing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm happy how it landed.
Well, I've got all sorts of things I want to talk with you about tonight. I read the book rapturously. That was a good probably 3 or 4 months ago now, but it's still vivid in my brain, and I was clever enough to actually jot down some things that I wanted to talk with you about then. So I thought maybe the obvious place to begin is the best place, and that is the genesis of the book. When I'm writing, very often I will have an idea for my next book when I'm in the middle of the one that I'm writing. And I wonder if you're that way, were there some aspects of this book, maybe a character or a theme or something that you knew about before you were finished with A Gentleman in Moscow? Or have you, when you're finished with one book, do you have the leisure to start thinking about these things? Tell us a little bit about where this book came from and kind of when. Sure.
And so for me, it's a little bit different in that I've been writing fiction since I was a kid, but unlike you, I had that sort of big hiatus where I stopped writing fiction and was in the investment field, but I've been generating ideas for stories or books since I was young that I have not had a chance to get to. And typically when an idea presents itself to me, it comes as of a very simple notion, a premise, a sentence, like a guy gets trapped in a hotel for a long period of time. That was it, right? That was the sentence for A Gentleman in Moscow. And when I had that notion, very quickly, it often comes with some particulars, like, oh, it'll be in Russia. That'll be great. And he'll be an aristocrat, and it'll be in a grand hotel, and it'll last 30 years. All of that hit me right off the bat. And then what'll happen is, over a period of years, if an idea like that grabs me, I'll start to imagine it in greater and greater detail, kind of walking down every avenue that it presents. Imagine
this is before you've written the first chapter, before you've written the first sentence. You're living with this all that time.
And in fact, years before. So, because what I'll do is I'll start filling notebooks with, but now until eventually I have another, it's time to do another project, and I'll kind of, because meanwhile I have different notebooks on different ideas at different levels of development. And so when I'm done with the book, I'm kind of looking across my table where I have these, a variety of ideas in various stages of development. And I ask myself, which one's next? And very, very often it's a predictable dynamic in that, having just spent 4 years writing about a middle-aged guy trapped in a hotel in a 30-year tale, I'm like, why not write the one about the 18-year-old boys driving across the country, and a story that lasts 10 days?
Exactly. Yeah,
it's a nice change for me. But it is the idea of Lincoln Highway is more than a decade old. And so I have been thinking about it for many years. And then, eventually you sit down a few years ago and start writing chapter 1 after all the thinking has been done. And for those who have not had a chance to pick it up yet, the premise that I'm talking about is this image that I had of a kid coming home from a juvenile work farm, and the warden saying, "You paid your debt to society and you should start your life fresh. You're a good kid." And that's his intention. But it turns out, when the warden drives away, that 2 kids from the juvenile facility have hidden in the trunk of his car, and everything starts to go awry. That was really the sentence that I started with. And then I built from there. And then I eventually sit down and write when the time comes.
When you can. Yeah. Well, but I have to say it's amazing. I don't think I've ever lived with an idea that long, or have come up with that kind of detail, because mostly for me it's a feature of my pen linking, my pen leaking, onto the page, and that's how that that's the fact that you can live with an idea for that long without it driving you absolutely crazy, and having to get that pen going is amazing to me. I wish I could do it.
Well, I think you're doing fine. I think you should stick with what's working for you, Rick. It's working for you. But I think that for me, and we all have a very different approach to the process, right? And some of us have been different approaches in different books. But
Sure.
for me, I really love I call it the design phase. And maybe this partially dates back to the fact that I had a career on the side where as I was walking to work or walking home, and I had, totally different kind of career I had to deal with all day, I just enjoyed the process of imagining one detail after another, and making use of that time to invent, right? Because I didn't necessarily have the time I wanted to sit down and write with a pen. But I think the way it's evolved for me is, and this is a little bit counterintuitive, is I do take all that imagination, I build it into a very detailed outline before I start chapter 1. The reason I use an outline is because it actually frees up my subconscious when I'm writing. Because when I'm sitting down to write chapter 5, I don't have to think about what's going to happen in the chapter, and or what is this about, or who are the characters who are going to appear through the door. I know all that, and that means that I can kind of allow myself to get lost in, as you say, the ink spilling dynamic. Where I know it's the setup. I'm into the situation, the scene, but then a lot of what comes out of the chapter is stuff that I wouldn't have anticipated, including characters doing things I didn't think, or ideas that rise up from the imagery that suddenly I realize, oh my God, this is really what this chapter is about. But I find that that's the nice balance for me, having a lot of planning, and then following my instincts when I'm in the game.
So, and you're willing to roll with that. If something comes up, you don't say no, that's not in the outline. You're perfectly good to go with a better idea replacing whatever you had in mind.
Absolutely. So I'll tell you 2 things about that. The first is that my outline, let's say, it might be 40 pages long when I'm ready to go. What happens when I'm writing the first third of the book is the back third of the outline is changing and getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Because as I'm writing the first third, I'm like, this character is not going to be only here for a scene. This character could be all the way to the end, and or this image is going to recur, or this conversation shouldn't happen now. It's going to happen in the second to last chapter. So I'm constantly pushing information to the back of the outline and changing the back of the outline. So it's getting thicker and thicker. And so by the time I'm writing the final third, it feels like a rocket ship to me, like it's just like, here we go. So that's going on. But in the case of the Lincoln Highway, the book is unusual relative to my other two works in that Rules of Civility is told from the perspective of a 25-year-old working class woman in New York in the 30s.
Mm-hmm.
A Gentleman in Moscow is third person, but told from the perspective of the Count, really. I mean, that's a third person that is an extension of his psychology. And this book is told from 8 points of view.
Right.
And it goes back and forth from these various characters. Well, what I was going to say was when I designed the book, and if you went back and looked at my outline on day one of the project of writing the book, it was designed to be told from the two perspectives. So Emmett, the hero, the young Midwesterner who did time, for a mistake in essence, and who was returned home to the family farm. He's one of the two. And Duchess.
And who's the other?
Duchess.
Duchess. That's if I had to guess, I would have said probably Duchess.
So this fast-talking, slippery kid who grew up in the kind of the failing vaudeville world among drunks and con men and performers.
Yeah.
And who is from the facility. That was the two voices. And so it was going to go each day. The 10-day story would go back and forth between Emmett and Duchess. And what ended up happening is I was probably almost a third of the way into the book. And I had created, I brought into the book these characters, Wooly and Sally, and I could hear their voices so strongly. Mm-hmm. And I was very aware of the fact that because Emmett and Duchess were telling the story, you heard their inner mindsets clearly, but as a reader, you only had sort of a distant sense of Sally and Wooly. And I was like, you know what? They've got to have a chance to say what they want to, we got to hear them and get a sense of what's going on in their head. So kind of at the 30% mark, I went back to the beginning and I redesigned the outline. I didn't change the course of events, the duration of the tale, but I rethought who would see what and suddenly handed over scenes and events to other characters. And suddenly I went from a 2-person, a thing to an 8 point of view novel. And I can't imagine this book as a 2-person point of view story anymore. I think it would be much less interesting. But
well, let me follow up and ask you something else about that then, because it's of the two voices, it seems to me that it's Duchess who now, as a result of your new plan, gets less, right? And we have Emmett. Emmett gets now the larger share of those two voices. He now gets the larger share.
Yeah. And
that seems to me to be exactly right too, in the sense that, in some ways, Duchess is my favorite character in the book. In some ways, he's the most morally complicated and flexible. But there's something about Duchess and certain characters in fiction. I wonder if you agree. There's certain characters in fiction where knowing exactly what's going on in their heads, the law of diminishing returns kicks in somehow. Yeah. And some characters benefit from remaining a little bit more mysterious and not knowing quite what they're thinking at every moment. And Duchess seems to me to be one of those characters that benefits somehow our affection for him and our because we're thinking now, what's he doing this for? And you spend a lot of time. And if you were actually there with him telling you, he would become less mysterious somehow. And your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very interesting observation. And so let me first of all say that one of the most interesting things about this book going out into the world is the 8 different perspectives are really told, even though 6 of the 8 are told in third person, 2 of the 8 are told in first person, but all of them, each of them is really the expression of the inner mindset of the individual character. It sounds like them, it's their vocabulary. It's been interesting to see, as that readers will come to me and say, oh, well, of course, the whole book is really about Emmett, or somebody will say, oh, it's really Billy. It's, Billy is where it's at. And occasionally someone says, well, it's Duchess, who, as you say, is this fast talking, charming, somewhat morally slippery character. And I always think it's interesting when who says it's Duchess, like you.
Yeah.
Because that tells me a lot about them. You know what I mean? Like
Yes,
that,
exactly. Exactly.
right. So that's a total Rick Russo thing. But yes, I think in any fast talking, charming person who is complicated morally, they're great in smaller doses, right? Because they're a high octane personality to begin with. So
Yes.
you wouldn't want to have them narrate War and Peace to you.
No.
It would wear you out. It would wear you out. So I think that and having the other personalities there ended up providing a very nice sort of balance. And and one of the things that came out of it, I think, and that I didn't think about this when I set out to write the book. I've thought a lot about it since, and the shift to the multiple characters really enabled this, which is that I think that a very central aspect of the book, in retrospect, is that we all, between the ages of 0 and 16, receive all this input and guidance from our parents, from school, from church, from our neighbors and our community, with our collective community. And all of them are telling us between 0 and 16, basically, how we should behave and what is right and wrong and how we should treat others and what we should expect of ourselves and what we can demand of ourselves and where we fall short. And this is all told to us, and some of it in the form of stories. Our parents tell us what happened when they were kids, and the church has parables, and school has novels and history books. But somewhere like around 17 or 18 is when we suddenly realize, wait a second, I can make all these decisions myself. I have the liberty and the responsibility to decide what's right and wrong, what I'm capable of, what I want to do with my life, where I want to go. And that's sort of this fascinating moment, I think. And when that happens, we inevitably, consciously or unconsciously, will take some of that feedback we've received as younger people and amplify it, we'll embrace it, or consciously or subconsciously, we'll reject it and say, in essence, I would never do what
press the mute button on that.
Yeah, exactly. Like my father's choices, I would never do any of those things in my life. In fact, I will go out of my way to live a different kind of life. And so I think that, as I say, this is a very central part of the book, is this moment in time, because you have Duchess, you have Wooly, you have Emmett, who are all around 18, Sally, the next door neighbor, who's 19, and all four of them are at that moment. And you can see them sort of in the course of this 10-day period. You can you get a glimpse of what are the influences they've had, which are the ones they're accepting, which are the ones they're rejecting, how are they sort of thinking about the future, and they're doing so very differently. So as where I was going with this is because, going back to your question about Duchess, I think adding in these two other voices of a similar age really helps sort of the complexity of that moment in our lives come to full fruition. Where if it was just the two, you wouldn't feel that quality of all the different ways that one becomes 18, depending on how you were raised and what you want,
I also thought when I was reading the book, this is interesting, because when I was reading the book, it seemed to me that this was, among other things, a book about loss of innocence. And the moment that you're describing, that 17 or 18-year-old person who's starting to say exactly that. Wait a second, this is my story. I think I'll tell it if you don't mind.
Yes, right.
That's that moment. Does it, to your mind, does that moment coincide to some degree with our loss of innocence? Because when we start doing that, we start making mistakes.
Yeah,
right.
That's a great question.
And it's interesting too, because there are other characters who are not in that moment, who also play off of it and allow us to understand. Billy, for instance, is not at that moment yet. Right. He's young. Yeah. He's a genuine innocent.
Yeah, that's right.
And there are a couple of other genuine innocents, and the Wooly, despite being older, is pretty close.
Yeah, he is pretty close. That's right.
So you do get this sense of the story unfolding about innocence, the loss thereof, and it's set in 1954, which makes this reader anyway wanted to say, okay, it's not just innocence within these characters that we're being introduced to, but there's also the year seems to suggest that maybe the nation something was going on in terms of the nation's innocence as well.
Yeah, I think those are both great observations, and so I'll respond to both because I think, and I hadn't really thought about the first half of what you said, sort of the loss of innocence and how it relates to this 18-year-old thing. But
Yeah.
as soon as you said it, it occurred to me that, and because I think this is probably true in life, is that in the story we can kind of feel where the loss of innocence begins with different characters, and very often it is the beginning of when they recognize that their parents are fallible, you know, or immorally compromised, or morally compromised, or deeply flawed. So, and that may come younger, right? You know, so in the case of Emmett, he grows up on a farm, but his father is a New Englander of upper class New Englander who's got a dream of being an Emersonian farmer, and he's not very good at it, you know. So Emmett grows up on a failing farm from the beginning. His mother abandons the family when he is 10 and his brother is born. And so you kind of think of that moment, probably even and maybe it's a way that he could not have articulated, but the loss of innocence really is beginning for him right there, right? Where, you know, a mother who abandons, and you have to kind of decide, are you going to, you know, shut her out of your mind? Or are you going to mope about it, you know? And a father, you begin to realize that, I think it's, you know, like when he's 13 or 14, he realizes, I got to get a job in town, you know, you know, this is a dead end. And so, you know, and maybe as I say, that's almost like the pre-18 beginnings where you at emotional level begin to recognize that something's wrong in my parents' lives, that they, you know, they're not as fulfilled as a fairy tale would describe, you know, as would make them. And so the loss of innocence probably begins there, but then really becomes sort of self-aware at 18. But, you know, when you talk about the country, I think you're right about that too. You know, right from the beginning, I thought of this as a story in the mid-50s, and that was my instinct. I didn't really have a strong, I've kind of after the fact have more opinions about why I said it in the 50s. Yeah. But I think that one of them is what you're saying is that, as it turns out, this is set in June of 54. 1954 is when literally the modern civil rights movement, for instance, is just about to begin. Because Brown and the Board versus Education is the spring of 54. And shortly thereafter, you have Rosa Parks. And that leads to, you know, the Montgomery protests, to the rise of Martin Luther King, to the lunch counter protests. This all comes very quickly on the heels of the 54 decision to enforce desegregation nationwide from the Supreme Court. This is kind of when feminism is beginning to come on the rise. The sexual revolution is beginning. December 53 is when Playboy is issued for the first time. And, you know, I kind of like to go back and remember that, you know, Hefner's vision was, you know, he wanted to take nudity out of the paper bag sold in an alley by a guy in a trench coat. Right. And he's like, I want this to be on the coffee table in your living room. And I mean, so that there's going to be interviews with statesmen and short stories by, you know, famous writers and you know, that, and there's going to be, and the photographs are going to be nude but classy, right? You know, I don't know. You know, that was kind of his vision, and he kind of won that war. You know, I mean, he, you know, it transformed. That was a part of, and then of course you end up getting the pill in 1960, and the sexual revolution really takes off. You know, but that's coming. The Vietnam War is beginning to
hovering,
just beginning, because 1954 is when they send the first advisors to Vietnam, and so it's years before we actually commit men. In a serious sense, the young men of America, but it's the commitment is getting deeper, and France is beginning to back out, and so you know that's beginning. So as you say, it's all these things, and rock and roll gets invented in 54 too.
That's right.
But so the loss of innocence that you're talking about, I think is it's just under the surface. 54 is this oasis. It's a time of peace, of prosperity, old values. You know that. But it's just about to get, you know, the can is going to get kicked over, you know, in a matter of minutes.
Yeah. And it's interesting now because in certain quarters, of course, politically in the United States right now, 1954, you're talking about it as on the cusp of all of these things that are so recognizable to us now: the civil rights movement, the sexual revolution. all of that. 1954, I think you could poll some conservative Republicans and say, what's the year that you want America to go back to?
Yes. Oh, for sure.
54 would come up, I think, as pretty much the year that we need to return to.
Yeah, when America was great.
Yeah. And I wondered,
a lot of people were miserable.
That's right. And I wondered when I first picked up the book, Amor, and we see these kids, and they're all in that window that you were talking about age-wise, and they start this journey, and it's 1954. My first thought was, oh God, I hope some good Black characters turn up pretty soon, because if they hadn't, you would have been in a world of you would have been probably accused of rhapsodizing exactly that thing, exactly what you're not doing. Is something that you probably would have been accused of, and it was just an enormous relief to see these wonderfully drawn Black characters come into the story. That made everything more complex, and we thought, all right. And I thought, all right, this is now the America that we're heading towards in this book, and this is the journey that Amor is taking us on. It's a journey of the 10-day journey of these young people, these kids, but it's also the journey. It's the beginning of a different American journey.
Yeah, well, I appreciate your saying that. And I certainly hope that that's true, and I think that again that was. Because Ulysses, one of the African American or Black characters, is a veteran who's returned from the Second World War and is drifting across the country for very specific reasons due to his own sense of guilt, and he's one of the voices, and Sally is one, as we talked about, as one of the voices, and bringing them into the vocal crowd who is telling us the events, I think was very helpful in as you say, opening up the narrative to something that feels a little bit more like the American experience,
right?
And less.
Sally is wonderful. Her response to all this testosterone floating around is just classic. It's wonderful.
Yeah. and I think that's a big relief. It's there, for Christ's sake.
I want to go back to something you said earlier about stories. And the importance of stories. I've always just loved stories about storytelling, and there's a lot of that in the Lincoln Highway. Stories are really important. Everybody seems to have one. Everybody has a story that they want to tell, and there's almost a way in which, because there are stories within stories within stories. There is a way in which I think you toy with the idea, and we all get a chance to kind of embrace it or not. We all have this. We all find ourselves thinking about what the value of story really is.
Yeah.
Can stories save us?
Right.
One of the things we keep hearing a lot in our troubled times right now is that one of the problems with America right now is that it seems to have lost its story, or it doesn't know what its story is, or it doesn't, or it did at one time and now it doesn't anymore. I'm curious about the fact that you've written this book that is so richly layered in various stories that seem to be communicating with each other.
Yeah. And I think it's well described. The one aspect of it goes back to sort of this notion of these young people who've received all these stories, and so the different characters have a different story that they care about, in essence. Mm-hmm. that Duchess kind of grew up in this failing vaudevillian world, so for him, many of the stories are the sort of these performers, these outrageous performers on the circuit and their acts, the guys, the escape guys, the magicians, and they're all kind of like half successful and past their prime, but it's very colorful for him, and that's influenced him. Those are the stories that he cares and relates to his friends. Sally is chewing up the Bible and spitting it out at all times, because she's a good churchgoer, but she doesn't, she's making up her own mind about most things. And so, that's kind of a part of her, private vernacular, as it were. Whereas the biggest one, of course, is Billy. The 8-year-old boy has this book, which is a compendium of adventurers and explorers and inventors. And there are 26 of them in the book. And it's written by this guy, Professor Abacus Abernathy.
I'm glad his name came up, because I wanted to ask you about him too, because strangely enough, as an adult, he's another of these innocents in your book.
Well, yeah, in a way, that's true. I mean, just like you and me.
That's right.
So Billy has this book, and it's 26 stories in heroes in alphabetical order, starting with Achilles and working the way down to Zorro. But it includes mythical figures like Achilles and Odysseus, Ulysses, but also historical figures like Thomas Edison or George Washington. And it's sort of this mix of as you can imagine, like a young boy's, sort of a book of heroes for young boys. It's explicitly for young boys. And so it's all, male heroes in that case. But they're all, mythic stories that either came down through the Western tradition for 1,000 years or through the American mythological narrative, like in the case of Washington or Lincoln, what have you. And he's obsessed with it. He reads the book over and over and over. And in the course of the novel, probably one of my favorite moments, and I don't want to give too much away or get too deep into it, is that when he meets the Black American veteran named Ulysses, have this. They're initially at odds in a way. I mean, Billy's just a boy, but the older veteran wants to be alone. He's not interested in the child, and they end up in a conversation where Billy is asking him questions about, he says, "Oh, did you go to war?" And he said, "Well," because he's heard his name, and Ulysses says, "Yes, I went to war." He said, "Well, did you go across the sea?" And he says, "Yeah, we all went overseas." He says, "Well, did you go reluctantly, and did you leave a wife and child behind?" And this is in fact what Ulysses did before the Second World War. And his wife said, "If you go and enlist, don't bother coming home, because I won't be here." And so when he comes home, in fact, she's gone, and he's ridden the rails feeling guilty and lonely ever since. And so to have this boy suddenly say this, it shocks him, that he's, asked him. And he says, I went reluctantly. I left my wife and son behind. And he says, "I know who you're named after." And Ulysses says, "Everybody knows who I'm named after. I'm named after Ulysses S. Grant, the general who freed, the slaves under President Lincoln." And he's like, no. You're named after the great Ulysses, who did these things, who went overseas, fought in the war, left a wife and child. And he says, and he traveled for 8 years, but he was reunited with his wife and son in 10 years after in the 10th year. So you got 2 years, until you're back. Yeah. And so what happens is through this word, Ulysses, which has 2 different, reference points, and that for the 2 characters, it means 2 different things. Through this, they connect, and they sort of they swap what the 2 different Ulysses are, and this, 8-year-old white boy from the Midwest and this, middle-aged Black veteran, from Chicago, find this connection, and it begins through the sharing of the stories. It changes, how they both see the world, what they might hope is possible. They become friends, and it has great implications in the back half of the book, all coming out of this. And so, I think that, is that me sort of either naively or hopefully believing in the power of narrative to bring 2 different people together and form a connection that both broadens their perspectives and gives them hope in the face of their own challenges and limitations? Yes.
Yeah.
The answer is yes.
Yeah. Something else along those. Oh, I remember what it was, and I'm going to ask you to explain it for listeners. There's a wonderful, as you probably know, I have been obsessed for the last probably decade and a half. My last 3 books have all been about destiny, and in this and in your novel, there's this wonderful description of destiny in terms of it's described. Human destiny is described as a diamond lying on its side.
Yes.
As an explanation for how human lives work. Could you
Yeah.
kind of explain that
Yeah.
because I just loved it.
Thank you. So the Abacus Abernathy, the
Right.
person who's written this book of adventure stories and historical figures, he has come to a point as is an older man, is alone in essence. His wife has died, his children have grown, and he's reflecting on it. And he says, I've long understood or believed that the great mythic stories have the shape of a diamond on the side. And the example he gives is Achilles, which
Right.
as a born, he's dipped in the water Styx by the finger that holds his ankle.
Right.
And over time, kind of he gains in strength and agility and intelligence, and goes through experiences and fame, and that's and travels the world and conquers enemies. And that's the sort of one side of the diamond. But at a certain point, it turns, and he doesn't know it's happening. But and when it turns, things are narrowing, and he suddenly has to go fight in the Trojan War, where he'll be for 10 years and will never leave,
Right.
and then he's, and the masses of friends are shrinking as they die,
Right.
And everything is narrowing to ultimately his fate, which is, being shot by a poison arrow in the ankle, the only spot on his body in which he is vulnerable. And then if you didn't know that about Achilles, that's not a spoiler. You should know that by now, audience. You should know that. That's what the Achilles heel is. But anyway, and this is, of course, is the story of the Iliad, is Achilles going towards that final point where he runs out of time, runs out of people, runs out of, and in the end, part of what that is that too is early in his life, he's interested in adventure and heroism and patriotism and all these sorts of things. But in the end, it's just revenge, because his best friend
everything at that point, all the complexity has narrowed to one thing. And it's interesting too, because one of the things that you point out about it is that for the character, I mean, we can look at it, we can look at his story afterwards and know exactly where he is in the diamond.
Yes.
But if you're the one in the diamond, you have no idea where you are.
Yes. And so that's what Abacus says. He says, even though he'd always thought about this, and he'd been thinking about this in terms of the historical figures, he'd suddenly realize it's true of all of us, and including himself. Yeah. And the tricky part is that, and it's kind of the geometry of it, at the turning point, it's the wings of the world are at their farthest point from you. So when they turn, it's impossible to see that they've changed their trajectory, and that things are beginning to shrink and come inward. And that's, and you can, and then eventually, then suddenly you can feel it. And but by the time you can feel it and see it,
it's too late.
It's happening. It's moving quickly inward, right? And so, but yes, I do think that as a personal note, the part of that whole notion came out of the fact that I grew up spending summers in a community where different generations spent a lot of time together. We were all kind of, we knew each other's parents and grandparents, and we all knew them by first name, and it was a very a great luxury to spend part of our summer in a community where we all returned. Your neighbors returned and their kids came, but etc. One year, I happened to look around and I realized, not long ago, but I realized that 3 of the members of the generation above me, who I knew extremely well, had influenced my life, I admired and loved, whatever. One of them, and they were parents of 3 friends of mine. One of them was losing her eyesight. She was on the verge of blindness. One was suffering from emphysema because he had smoked as a marine or whatever, or decades before, and one had begun to suffer from dementia. And as I looked at them, and I thought, these 3 ailments are so dramatically different, but the outcome was identical, which is that their world had shrunk. Whether the blind person couldn't move around, the person with emphysema, couldn't get around very much anymore, and the one who was suffering from dementia, what couldn't move, and it kind of, the world had shrunk to the community, and then basically they were in their homes, and so and it was a very painful thing to watch this, and these 3 people that were such vibrant parts of my life. But so the Abacus says that he says, I had 3 friends as a young man, and this is what happened to the 3 of them. But that, I think that's part of where that notion sort of came from, sort of watching that. And by the way, knowing I'm next, right? By the way, right with this.
I have more to tell you on that, actually, on that subject, actually, but not tonight. And also that in a strange way brings us back, the shape of human lives, the shape of destiny, the fact that we don't know where we are in the diamond, and we may very well mistake where we are in the diamond. We may think we're closer to the end than we actually are. We may think we're closer to the beginning than we actually are.
That's right.
That brings us back to the shape of stories too, because there's a good deal of discussion in this book about where to begin a story,
Yeah.
and whether to begin, as we're often told, in the middle, in medias res.
Yeah.
But the same problem crops up, doesn't it? Because you have to get to the end before you know where the middle is.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's a storyteller's dilemma. You seem to know right where the middle of this story was, where it begins at that particular moment in 1954.
Yeah.
There's the shape of it's going to take. It's going to be 10 days, but then there's all the stuff that's led up to this point where Duchess and Emmett, and they're all going to go on their trip. And here again, we're blind. We're all as human beings, even as we tell stories, we're kind of flying blind, as a result of not knowing where we are in the trajectory of life.
Yeah. And I love that. I love that uncertainty. Right? That's what makes the books fun. But yes, and because I'm a planner, I know.
That's right. Well, one more question. I think I know the answer to this. We're getting close to the time where we should get some audience questions in here.
Terrific.
But one more general question that I had is that in my experience, we both know a lot of writers now, and we talk to a lot of our writer friends about their books over the course of the last however many years we've been at this. My sense is, and I was thinking about this in connection with all three of your novels. It seems to me that some people write they're writing out of certain obsessions, and they return to those obsessions again and again. Other writers seem to be writing out of an infinite curiosity about the world and a desire to engage in as much of that as possible. And the reason I was thinking about this in connection with the Rules of Civility, Gentlemen in Moscow, and now The Lincoln Highway, is that to look at those three novels, the first thing you notice is how different they are. And you kind of explained that in the sense, you finish one that does a certain amount of things. It's only natural to want to write a different novel that makes use of different tools in your toolbox, exactly. and to do the exact opposite of what you've done. But as I was looking at these three, and I love all three of your novels, what I was trying to figure out was whether there was an obsession that was driving. Is there some linkage between these books? Is there an obsession that you're going back to, or are you the kind of writer who is infinitely curious and just wants to go to as many different places as possible?
It's a fascinating question, because I've been thinking about it a little bit also about relative to you, right? So, because we've talked over the years, and you've been very public about the fact that sort of, I think you've said at certain times, like, I got a story, I'm going to keep telling it, right?
No, I'm one of those obsessional writers. No,
and your depiction of that turning point in American towns in the Northeast, when it went from 1955, everything's looking great, and it's been just a great run for a century, to it wearing slow. And you speak very beautifully on how slow the change is when it comes to a community, which is the diamond in the community sense, right? Which is that it's not like a factory closes, everybody loses their job, and that's the day. It's a water torture dynamic over generations, in fact.
Yeah.
Well, you've talked about the view as an American dynamic, but you've gotten inside those communities in a beautiful way, right? And different, telling very different stories in different locales, but you've talked about kind of that as being something that haunts you or whatever.
Yeah.
And I think it's because I think the difference between you and me is that your youth was much more interesting than mine. I honestly
somehow I doubt that, but
no, I think that's true. I think that's true. I think what happens is that you take two people like you and me, and we're both, born to want to write and to imagine and to use words. And if you give one like a really interesting youth, you're like, this is incredible, right? I'm going to talk about this the rest of my life. If you give someone like raise them in the suburbs of Boston in the 70s, he's like, well, I better make it up, Because I don't know. I think that's the difference.
Well, on that note, let's get Rachel. Rachel, are you there? Would you like to come back in and take over?
I am back, and we have some amazing questions from the audience for both of you, and some great things going on. So audience, thank you for those great questions. You're making my job very easy tonight, though hard to choose. To start things off, one that I love that came in from Monica was, what were your favorite books as a child, and what books that you read in childhood influenced you as a writer?
Rick?
As a child, I read whatever I was not supposed to, and nothing that was assigned. The book that I'm writing right now has one of my main characters, Chief of Police Raymer, who has been given the novel Great Expectations to him as a boy by his 8th grade teacher. And he reads the first chapter with it has Magwitch on the march, seemingly threatening Pip, and he takes the book home and shoves it in the back of his closet because he's just terrified of it. He doesn't want to read the book. And I think I read really. I never challenged myself. I was kind of that kid. I was like Raymer. Anytime he gave me something I should have been reading, either it was too soon, or I was just unwilling, and I shoved all that stuff in the back of my closet and read the Hardy Boys for like 20 years.
I was just about to say, I swear to God, I was about to answer the question, Hardy Boys. I swear to God, because that's what it was, and that's what it was. I think that the reading as a compulsion is a very interesting moment, that when it hits you, right? And you can see it in different kids. You can read, you have to read, you read a little bit, you get read to, but then you suddenly have this moment where it's like, oh, I must read the next book, or I must read, I want to go, I don't care if it's the Christmas party. I'm going to sit in the corner behind the tree and read my book, because I'm in, and for me, that began with the Hardy Boys. And my father, because in the 70s, growing up in middle class of 70s, sort of middle class lifestyle, we didn't go to the movies very often. We never went to restaurants. We occasionally got to go on a trip. But my dad was like, "You want to read? If you want a book, I'll buy it for you." And that was kind of the one thing you could have without negotiation. But I didn't take advantage of that until I read the first Hardy Boys, and then I really took advantage of it.
And then you had to own them all, right?
Yeah, and I was like doing it in a day. So I was reading it, until late at night with the flashlight, and then you get up in the morning and go, I need the next one. And my dad being like, oh my God, the next one. So, but that was it. It was the same thing for me. That's where it began.
And then you from there you discover Sherlock Holmes, and you discover what the best of that genre is like.
That's right.
And
that's just what it was like.
Yep.
Fantastic. The Hardy Boys. I love it. I love seeing that with kids in the store. When the world opens up to them, they find whatever their thing is. There are a lot of questions about research. Your books are so well researched, and the one I just pulled up is William, but there's a ton of audience members asking about this. William says, though you're writing fiction, I love your writing because the details feel so well researched. Can you talk about how that impacts your writing process?
And I'm interested in hearing you talk about it too, Rick. I mean, I know we write very different styles, but what is the role of research in your work? Because you do write about different places and different moments in time and different backgrounds. How does it work for you, if at all? I mean, do you do any, and when do you do it?
I generally do it at the end. I will tell my story, and I will have if one of my characters is a cop who's investigating something. Well, I'm not a cop, and I've never done an investigation, so I try to write what I'm writing about. And then when I'm reading what I've written about that scene, that's when I recognize how thin it is, and what I'm doing, all the things I'm doing to cover up the fact that I don't know shit about being a cop. or being a lawyer, or being a doctor, or a dentist, or anything, any of the other things other than a writer, the thing that I am, all those other things, I don't know very much. But I do have, I'm fairly brash about not researching until the end, because something happened early in my writing career. I'll try to make this a short story, but I did have something happen in one of my novels that I had a character who had a false teeth, and he took out his, I think the word that I used was his bridge. But in any case, if you've had a lot of your teeth pulled, there are two different kinds of things that you can have inserted into your mouth. One is called a bridge, and the other is called something else. And one you can take out, and the other gets cemented right in there, and you can't, unless somebody punches it out, it stays right there. You don't take it out and put it in a jar at night. So anyway, I wrote this and I got it wrong, and my editor didn't find it. My proofreader didn't. Nobody found it. And this woman came up to me one day and she said, I have worked in a dentist's office as a nurse at a dentist's office my whole life, and I never knew that there was such a thing as a bridge that you could take out. And of course, she was the one who knew what was right, and I didn't, but she believed it. So my feeling is ignorance is just fine. Just the roughs, just correct the most egregious mistakes that you can, and trust in the fact that other people are going to trust you.
That story ended the opposite I thought I was going to end. I really, this is like, I would have been fascinated to be raised by Rick Russo, right? Where you're hearing the moral and you think, well, I know what he's getting at, but no, it's the opposite. No, but I love that. All right. So, and you're right. For me, I'm the same way. So, I write about things that I'm already interested in. So I was interested in Russia. I was interested in the 30s. I'm interested in the 50s. I invent without any applied research, and because I think for the same reasons you're talking about, right? I want to see it, I want to hear it, I want it to be true to the characters and their stakes, their personalities. And I don't want to be start cluttering the room with furniture before I can figure out what's happening. But I sometimes even keep a little list going. I say, I kind of want to know more about that thing, and I will write with placeholders. As you said, I kind of be like, something happens here.
Right.
Really precise when I figure out, but I'm not going to do the work at the end. But from the bigger picture standpoint, I think in the spirit of what your story, because I do feel the same way. For me, I've come to think of it as my work. I think it's like a stage set where, if you got a play, and in the very back of the stage is a painted canvas, where you can see kind of the trees in the distance or whatever. And, that it's two-dimensional, and they use the Renaissance tricks of perspective to give you a sense of depth, so it's going off in the distance. It's not painted in hyperrealism, because that would look weird to the eye, right? It's painted in the kind of impressionist style with the trees and the light and everything. In front of that, though, that's out through the French doors. In front of that, you've got a bunch of bookcases built out of plywood and painted to look like mahogany, by the guys of the crew, and there's a door going nowhere. Right. But in front of that is an actual table with actual chairs. Right. And when the characters come, they pull the chairs. You can hear them scrape on the floor. They sit down. There's an actual China tea service on the table. And when they are talking, when the brother slams his hand on the table, you can hear it and feel it in the theater. And this is the way I think of my work, is that, history for me is the painted backdrop. The thing that's the impressionist thing. I don't care how accurate it is, really. It's a part of the illusion. Then there's a lot of stuff I have made up and painted, plywood I painted to look like mahogany that might sound real to you, but it's not necessarily real. But I'm really very interested in, and I think you're the same, in the people sitting at the table in the front of the room, because that's really where that's where a novel lives and dies, is do the people and their exchange of ideas, their exchange of sentiments, do their gestures, facial expressions, their commitments, do they come across as real to the reader? And if they do, all this other stuff is just sort of helping there to aid the illusion. You know what I mean? And so I don't worry about it too much. But a big difference, your story, probably the dentist story, probably predated email from the way you told that story.
That's right.
Because in the world of email, you don't wait like a, yeah, you hear about it,
No. And in this book that I'm working on right now, I have a guy that's driving a wrecker, and he has to put a car that's been totaled, and he has to put it on the record. I went to YouTube and watched half a dozen videos of how you use the straps, how you tie the straps on, how you secure the wheels, how you keep it from rolling on the rig, all that stuff. But I didn't do that until the very end. First I wanted to find out who was driving the truck and what he was doing and what he had to say for himself.
Absolutely.
So we're running low on time, but there were a ton of audience questions about character development. And so I'd love to quickly touch on that. It's one of the things that kept coming up over and over again, and specifically how you develop characters, what that process is like for you, and if there are characters who are easier or harder for you to write or that you feel more connected to.
Richard?
For character development, I'll tell you what is easier for me and what is more difficult for me. Here's the thing is, I have a much better ear than eye, and as a result of that, I tend to develop my characters by listening to them talk to each other and to me, and so their dialogue is my first and foremost concern. It's the way that I feel like I'm going to learn most about them. But that said, because my eye isn't as good as my ear, what happens is that sometimes when I'm writing a scene, especially an early draft of a scene, is that I feel like I'm taking dictation. And so then I will have to go back and back and back and back to fill in gestures. Flannery O'Connor used to used to have her students draw. She'd have them, go out with a pen or a pencil and a sheet of paper. And basically what she wanted her students to do is recognize the validity, the importance of the real world. And you're not going to get inside that world unless you're actually looking at it, unless you're actually looking at what's there. And because my eye is very lazy compared to my ear, my difficulty in characterization is going slow enough, slowing time down enough so that I see everything that I would see if it were real and I were actually there. At my worst, I am simply taking dictation of what these characters are saying, and so for me, it's a question of just slowing down, paying attention, look at the world, what's there.
I share this dynamic, I think, in to a great degree, in that for me, and I think of it as, for me, it's about tone and voice. And I'm, if you've read Rules of Civility, read A Gentleman in Moscow, read my work, you know this about me. I'm very interested in how tone of voice and point of view can be at the center of the narrative experience. And so that each book has a different vocabulary, a different set of poetics, a different semantics, a different psychological bias, a different sense of humor, depending on who is at the center of the story. And that the characters for me grow out of hearing them first. And in a way, I don't really know them well until I can, hear them. I could sit back and say, oh, he was born in Boston in 19 whatever, and he's, in the upper middle class and went to boarding school and and I could do a bio like that. Mm-hmm. It would mean nothing in narrative terms until I actually hear the guy say something. Mm-hmm. And how they observe something that necessarily, they don't have to say it out loud. It could be sort of how when they walked into a room and something's going on, what would they see first? What conclusion would they draw? What memory would it bring up? And it kind of, how would they phrase it? And that's the stuff where when I write even a very brief, it could be like less than a paragraph, sometimes where that's happening, I could get to the end of that and be like, oh, okay, I know this guy now. And then all that other stuff kind of comes into focus, or even might get changed or tweaked, in the bio. Because now I really actually know who the person is. In terms of the other
stuff is just facts. There's a difference between knowing something and knowing about something, right?
Yeah,
Knowing about something, we all know about things, but
Yeah.
knowing something is different than knowing about something.
This has
Amor, this has
been,
been just a joy.
Rick, Rick, I miss you. It's good to see you.
maybe 3-dimensionally sometime in the not too distant future. That would be
Yeah,
nice.
that would be grand.
I think everyone here could listen to the two of you talk all night long. This has been an utter delight. Thank you both so much for taking the time to share with us this evening.
Thank you, Rachel.
Audience-
Thank you, everybody, for coming. Rick, thank you for joining me. It's a real pleasure.
Thank you.
Audience, thank you so much for supporting your local indies, and thank you to our wonderful indie bookstore partners. Thank you, authors, and hopefully we'll see you all again at another event soon. Have a great night, everybody.
Bye-bye, everybody.